Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
I was devastated. I thought if I could build a time machine that I could go back and see him again and tell him what was going to happen, maybe save his life. And so that became an obsession.
There is a particular kind of obsession that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with warning signs or dramatic turning points. It creeps in quietly, disguised as curiosity, wearing the face of passion, until one day the person carrying it looks around and realizes they have crossed some invisible line, and there is absolutely no coming back from the other side. Raymond Colt crossed that line somewhere around 1991, in a rented garage on the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky, surrounded by salvaged copper wire, borrowed oscilloscopes, and library books with cracked spines. He was 31 years old, entirely self-taught, and completely convinced that the fundamental nature of time was not what anyone thought it was. And for 6 years, nobody listened. Nobody cared. He was just another eccentric with grease on his hands and a wild theory scrawled across a legal pad. Then, in March 1997, Raymond Colt fired up the machine he had spent the better part of a decade building, stepped into the field it generated, and was never seen again. The garage burned that same evening. When fire crews arrived, they found melted equipment, destroyed electrical components, and a near-perfect circular burn mark scorched into the concrete floor roughly 7 feet in diameter. There were no human remains. There was no body. There was nothing that indicated Raymond Colt had died in that fire, and nothing that indicated he had walked away from it either. What investigators did find, sitting in a fireproof metal cabinet bolted to the rear wall of the garage, was a single sealed envelope. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter. The opening line read, "By the time anyone reads this, I will either be the most important discovery in human history, or I will be a cautionary tale. Either way, I am sorry for the mess." For nearly 3 decades, Raymond Colt became exactly what he had feared: a story, a legend, a whispered name on late-night radio programs and paranormal forums. Some people believed he had accidentally killed himself, and the fire destroyed the evidence. Others were convinced he had genuinely done what he claimed, cracked open some seam in the fabric of experienced time and fallen through it. A small but devoted group of internet researchers spent years cataloging every detail of his life, building an enormous and obsessive archive of claims, counterclaims, photographs, and alleged documents. And then, in the late spring of 2026, Raymond Colt came home. To understand what happened in 1997, you have to understand who Raymond Colt was before any of this began. He grew up the son of a coal miner in eastern Kentucky, the kind of place where ambition was treated with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. His father was a practical man who believed in what he could hold in his hands. His mother was a schoolteacher who quietly stacked science paperbacks on his nightstand and never said a word about it. Raymond inherited something from both of them, a fierce practicality combined with an almost painful hunger to understand how things work beneath the surface. He never went to university. The money wasn't there, and the timing never aligned. Instead, he went to work at 19 doing electrical maintenance at a regional hospital, teaching himself on the job, reading voraciously at night, building small projects in the spare room of his apartment. He was the kind of person who could look at a broken machine and intuitively understand what had gone wrong, not because he had memorized textbooks, but because he had spent years developing a near-physical sense for how electrical systems behaved. By his mid-20s, he had saved enough to rent a small house on the edge of town, and with it came a detached garage that would eventually become the most important and most catastrophic space of his life. The obsession began, as so many obsessions do, with a small and inexplicable anomaly. Raymond had been building high-voltage demonstration equipment, the kind of projects that appealed to his instincts for dramatic, powerful electricity. Jacob's ladders, Tesla coils, plasma globes. During one late-night session in 1989, he was running a high-frequency arc discharge through a configuration he had modified based on some fringe physics papers he had found through an interlibrary loan system. The arc behaved normally for about 40 minutes. Then something shifted. The arc stabilized in a way it had no business stabilizing. And a small metal washer, sitting on the ceramic plate beside the apparatus, disappeared. Not fell. Not moved. Disappeared. Raymond sat in his chair and stared at the empty ceramic plate for a long time. Then he reached over and cut the power. The washer reappeared, sitting exactly where it had been, slightly warmer than the ambient temperature of the room. He did not sleep that night. He did not sleep very well for the next several years. What followed was a methodical, grinding, intensely private period of experimentation that Raymond documented in extraordinary detail. He kept numbered journals, eventually more than 40 of them, recording every configuration, every power level, every environmental condition, every result. He was systematic in a way that would have been impressive coming from a trained physicist. Coming from a self-taught electrician in rural Kentucky, it was something else entirely. The core phenomenon he was chasing was what he came to call a phase boundary, a condition in which an object within a specific electromagnetic field configuration appeared to briefly decouple from normal observable reality. The object didn't move in any conventional spatial sense. It didn't vibrate itself apart or convert to energy. It simply ceased to be present in the space it had occupied, and then returned to that exact space moments later, unchanged except for minor temperature variations and, in some cases, subtle structural changes at a microscopic level. He tested with screws, with coins, with ceramic tiles, with small woodblocks. He tested with liquids in sealed containers. He tested with electronic components that were powered during the displacement. The results were consistent enough to rule out equipment malfunction, optical illusion, and static discharge within the first year of systematic work. By 1993, he was convinced beyond any reasonable doubt that he had discovered something genuine. The question was what, exactly, he had discovered. His working theory, laid out across dozens of careful journal pages, was that time as human beings experience, it is not a fixed river, but a kind of consensus. A perceptual agreement between observers, mediated by electromagnetic and quantum interactions at the neurological level. What his machine disrupted was not time itself, but the local synchronization between an object and the observational field that kept it anchored to shared reality. When the phase boundary formed, an object effectively stepped outside the consensus. It existed somewhere in some state, but it became inaccessible to any instrument or observer operating within normal perceptual parameters. He could not prove this. He knew that. But it was the only framework that accounted for everything he was seeing. In 1994, he scaled the experiments up. He built a larger apparatus, improved his field stabilization considerably, and began testing with small living organisms. He documented these experiments with particular care, aware that they represented a significant ethical escalation. The results troubled him deeply. Living subjects emerged from displacement experiences disoriented and physiologically stressed in ways he could not fully explain. Something about the experience, whatever the experience actually was profoundly incompatible with biological systems that had evolved entirely within normal perceptual consensus. This should have stopped him. It did not stop him. Raymond made contact with the outside world in late 1994, not through any scientific institution. He had tried that avenue and received the exact response anyone might predict, but through the late-night radio circuit that existed in that era as the primary clearinghouse for ideas too strange for mainstream acceptance. He appeared on several programs over the following 2 years, talking carefully and precisely about what he had observed, consistently framing his claims as experimental results rather than theoretical speculation. He was credible in a way that made people uncomfortable. He didn't use the vocabulary of science fiction. He didn't claim to have traveled anywhere. He described voltage configurations, field geometries, thermal anomalies. He answered technical questions with technical answers. The callers and hosts who expected to find a crank found instead a quietly intense man who seemed genuinely frightened by his own work. During one broadcast in the summer of 1995, a caller with engineering credentials pressed him hard on the energy requirements for producing a stable phase boundary at human scale. Raymond's answer was detailed, specific, and, according to the caller, disturbingly plausible. After the show, that caller reportedly drove 8 hours to Harlan County. Whether he ever made it, and what he saw if he did, is unknown. Raymond mentioned a visitor in a journal entry from that period, but provided no name and only sparse details. By early 1996, Raymond's journal entries began to change in tone. The methodical, almost clinical documentation that had characterized the earlier volumes gave way to something more urgent, more pressured. He was sleeping less. He was eating irregularly. He had become convinced that the machine was close, that with one more significant modification to the field geometry, he could stabilize a phase boundary large enough and stable enough to step through himself. He knew this was dangerous. He wrote extensively about the danger. He wrote about the mouse experiments, about the thermal anomalies, about his theory that the biological stress he observed in living subjects was a product of the profound neurological violence of being temporarily decoupled from observational consensus. He wrote that a human brain might sustain permanent damage from such an experience. And then, several pages later, he wrote that he was going to do it anyway. On the night of March 14, 1997, Raymond Colt fired up the third-generation machine he had spent the previous 8 months building. The machine occupied most of the garage's floor space by this point, a large circular frame constructed from copper and aluminum with a complex arrangement of field-generating components positioned around its perimeter. Raymond had reinforced the garage's electrical supply significantly, working carefully within legal limits but pushing those limits as far as they would go. He had spent 3 days running calibration tests. He had written a long letter to no one in particular and sealed it in the fireproof cabinet. Then he stood in the center of the frame and activated the machine. What happened next is something Raymond described in detail 29 years later, sitting in a diner outside Columbus, Ohio, with a journalist who had spent a decade following his story. He described it calmly, in the same precise, unadorned language he had used in his journals, as if reporting data rather than recounting the most terrifying night of his life. The phase boundary formed around him, and Raymond did not go anywhere. He was still in the garage. He could see everything exactly as it had been, the workbench, the shelving, the equipment. But the quality of his perception shifted in a way he had no adequate vocabulary to describe. The world did not slow down. It did not freeze. It became somehow less present, as if he were watching it through glass that had very subtly thickened, as if he were still fully in the room but the room was slightly less sure he was there. He stood in the field for what felt to him like 4 or 5 minutes. When the machine's power supply began to fail, a thermal protection mechanism he had built and activated, the field collapsed. Raymond stepped out of the frame. The garage smelled of hot copper and ozone. Several hours had passed. More importantly, something in the quality of his connection to observable reality had changed. He could feel it immediately in the way that a person who has damaged their hearing can immediately feel the change, even before they have confirmed it by trying to listen. The machine's overloaded components caught fire approximately 40 minutes after the field collapse. Raymond escaped the garage with his sealed letter cabinet, 3 journals, and a single box of documentation. He watched the garage burn from the tree line at the edge of the property, and then he got in his truck and drove away. And that is where the story, as most people understood it, ended. The truth of what the following 29 years were like for Raymond Colt is something that resists easy description, because the central problem he faced is genuinely difficult to communicate to someone who has never experienced anything remotely like it. He was not invisible. People could see him, hear him, interact with him in real time without any apparent difficulty. He was present in every observable sense of the word. But something about the way other minds processed and retained the fact of his existence had been fundamentally altered. People who spoke with him at length would, within hours, find the details of his face and voice becoming oddly slippery in their memory. People who work alongside him for days would, a week later, have only the vaguest impression that there had been a man named Raymond who worked there for a while. People who should have had every reason to remember him, employers, landlords, people he had genuine conversations with, found that his presence refused to consolidate in their long-term memory. He compared it, in the Columbus diner, to trying to remember a dream you were certain was important. The emotional residue lingers. The knowledge that something happened is intact. But the specifics, the face, the voice, the texture of the actual experience, dissolve with a speed that feels almost like active resistance. He spent the first several years trying to reverse or manage the effect, corresponding under assumed identities with researchers in fields ranging from quantum biology to cognitive neuroscience, never disclosing the full context, always probing carefully around the edges of what he needed to know. He sent technical diagrams to a physics researcher in 2006 under circumstances that remain murky, asking only that the work be studied and not replicated, a request born from what he described as genuine horror at the possibility of someone else ending up where he'd ended up. He worked cash jobs. He lived in places where nobody needed to remember his name past the end of the week. He kept meticulous journals, the continuation of a discipline that had been the organizing structure of his adult life, documenting not only his ongoing attempts to understand what had happened to him, but also the progression of the effect itself. Because the effect was progressive. Each period of elevated stress, each time he pushed himself to maintain social connections that required people to hold his memory over time, seemed to deepen the desynchronization. He was not a scientist making controlled observations anymore. He was a man watching himself slowly become less real to the people around him, and the watching itself seemed to accelerate the process. He had, he said, periods of profound despair. That is an understatement so massive as to be nearly meaningless, and he acknowledged that with a short, humorless exhale when he said it. He had periods of something that went so far beyond ordinary despair that he didn't have a word for it. The experience of being alive, being present, being conscious and aware and full of every internal complexity that makes up a human life, while simultaneously feeling that consciousness slowly stopped mattering to the external world that had previously confirmed it. He had considered not continuing. He said this plainly, without drama, and then he moved on. What brought Raymond back into contact with the world he had been sliding out of was a decision made with characteristic deliberateness. He had been planning it for years, not a return exactly, because he understood that a full return was no longer possible, but a final accounting, a transfer of documentation, an attempt to ensure that what he had discovered and what had happened to him would not simply dissolve along with his capacity to be remembered. He had years earlier researched locations with specific electromagnetic stability characteristics, places where the background field conditions were such that stored equipment and documents would remain minimally affected by the kind of ambient interference that had complicated his work throughout his experiments. He had identified a property in rural Ohio and arranged through an elaborate series of intermediaries to have a sealed wooden box placed in the attic during a renovation period when the property was between owners. Inside the box was everything. Every journal, every diagram, every photograph, every piece of documentation he had accumulated across nearly 3 decades. He had calculated, based on the property's sale history and regional real estate patterns, approximately when the next owner would renovate and find it. He was off by about 14 months, which he considered acceptable. When the Hendersons, a young couple who had bought the farmhouse as a renovation project, posted about their discovery online, Raymond saw it within days. He had maintained intermittent internet access throughout the years through a combination of public terminals and prepaid devices, and he had set up search parameters for certain specific phrases that he expected to appear when the box was eventually found. He reached out through a contact method he had prepared years in advance. He arrived at the Henderson farmhouse on a Tuesday evening in early May 2026. He was 66 years old and looked, by most accounts, closer to 80. Not because he had aged with unusual physical speed, but because the kind of life he had lived for nearly 3 decades, the isolation, the dislocation, the grinding persistence of a man trying to remain coherent in a world that was increasingly unable to hold him, had settled into his face and body in the way that extreme experience tends to do. He sat with the Hendersons for approximately 4 hours. He explained, in the same careful and precise language that had characterized his journals and his old radio appearances, what the machine had done and what the following years had been. He answered their questions fully and without deflection. He showed them documentation. He asked them for 3 things: that the journals reach people qualified to study them responsibly, that the attic remain secured and undisturbed, and that they not attempt to follow up or maintain contact after he left. He explained why, regarding that last request, every sustained interaction that required people to hold his memory over time now accelerated the deterioration. The longer someone knew him, the faster he slipped from their recall. Brief encounters left traces. Extended relationships left almost nothing. He had learned to move through the world in short exposures, like a man who knows direct sunlight will burn him and has organized his entire life around staying in the shade. He was running out of shade. The Hendersons have described, in several interviews conducted in the weeks following his visit, the experience of watching Raymond's memory dissolve in real time even as they sat across from him. Not during the conversation itself. While he was present, he was entirely present, vivid and detailed and real in the way that people are real when you are looking directly at them and listening to them speak. It was afterward. Within the first hour of him leaving, they noticed that the details of his face were becoming difficult to hold. The particular quality of his voice was slipping. They found themselves reaching for specifics that should have been perfectly fresh: the color of his jacket, the exact words of a particular sentence, the expression on his face when he described the night of the fire, and finding a frustrating blankness where those details should have been. Mrs. Henderson began writing immediately. Mr. Henderson took photographs of every document in the box within the first 30 minutes of Raymond's departure, operating on an instinct he couldn't have explained except that something felt urgent about capturing evidence before it became inaccessible in some way he didn't fully understand. By the following morning, they were relying entirely on the written notes and photographs to reconstruct what had happened. The living memory, the actual experiential record of sitting across from another human being and hearing his voice, had not exactly vanished. It had become unreachable, the way a word sometimes sits just beyond the reach of conscious retrieval, present somewhere in the system but inaccessible to direct search. They described this experience not as ordinary forgetting, but as something that felt like active removal. As if the memories existed but had been filed in a location that their minds could no longer navigate to. They knew they had been there. They knew it had been real. The evidence was spread across their dining room table. But the experience of it, the phenomenological fact of having sat across from Raymond Colt, was becoming something they could only access through the mediation of their own written record. That, Raymond had told them, was what unmemory looked like from the inside. The journals and documentation from the wooden box have since been reviewed by several individuals with relevant technical backgrounds. None of them have been named publicly, both because Raymond explicitly requested confidentiality for anyone involved in the research, and because those involved are understandably cautious about association with work this far outside established scientific parameters. What has been described by those individuals, in careful and hedged terms, is that the documentation is not obviously fraudulent, not obviously the product of delusion, and contains technical material that is genuinely difficult to account for coming from a self-taught electrician working in isolation during the 1990s. That is as far as anyone has been willing to go publicly, and it is frankly about as far as intellectual honesty currently allows anyone to go. Whether Raymond Colt discovered something real, and if so, what exactly he discovered, remains entirely unresolved. What is not unresolved is what the experience cost him. There have been scattered, unverified reports since May 2026 of a man matching Raymond's general description appearing briefly in unlikely places, asking pointed questions in university physics department corridors, spending a single evening at a shelter in western Pennsylvania, appearing at the edge of a small conference on consciousness research in upstate New York. No one who reports these encounters can describe him in consistent detail afterward. No one remembers his name without being reminded of it. No one has been able to maintain contact. He is out there, most likely, still moving, still in possession of whatever interior life has persisted through 3 decades of extraordinary dislocation. Still breathing, still thinking, still carrying the accumulated weight of a discovery that broke the discoverer along with every assumption he had started with. The machine worked. That is what he told the Hendersons, and what his journals suggest, and what the circular burn mark in the concrete floor of a burned Kentucky garage has always implied. The machine worked in some fundamental and terrible sense. It just did not work the way Raymond Colt had imagined it would when he stood at his workbench in his 20s, teaching himself physics from library books and believing, with the absolute conviction of a certain kind of brilliant and isolated mind, that he was on the edge of something extraordinary. He was on the edge of something. That part was right. The question he could never answer, the one that runs through all 40-plus journals, through all the late-night radio calls and the careful technical diagrams, and the long deteriorating years of life as a man the world could no longer hold in its memory, is whether what he found on the other side of that edge was worth the crossing. There is no evidence he ever concluded that it was. There is also no evidence that he ever stopped believing the work mattered. Raymond Colt is still out there, somewhere in the fraying edge of other people's attention, a face that dissolves before it can be fully remembered, a name that slips before it can be properly said, present in every sense except the one that ultimately makes a person real to the world, the simple, irreplaceable fact of being held in someone else's mind. The machine took everything from him except his existence. Whether that is better or worse than the alternative is perhaps the most haunting question this story leaves behind.